It's 1954, and the CIA is getting ready to overthrow Guatemala's democratically elected president, Jacobo Árbenz. It was a hairy time when fears of communism reaching the West was nearing its peak, and would soon boil over with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s. But looming behind all that fear was the interests of United Fruit Company, a multinational corporation that was reaching its arms throughout Latin America and got to the point of owning over 40% of Guatemala's arable land in the 1900s. So when a democratically elected president threatens its interests, the corporation sees no choice but to be entangled with a campaign that ends in foreign intervention and the overthrow of that government. This is a story of Guatemala. A country that has been through centuries of instability, that when it was given the chance to possibly find a forward-thinking leader to help bring its people up from poverty, ended up being the target of one of the most powerful corporations in the history of Latin America. For generations, United Fruit Company became a symbol for foreign economic power in Central America. In Guatemala, its influence was so extensive that critics became to describe the company as El Pulpo, or the octopus. Its tentacles extended out to all parts of the country's economics and politics. But this story is more complicated than the idea that a single company literally ruled an entire country. Guatemala already had a deeply unequal society, with land and wealth being controlled by a small elite, and indigenous and rural communities faced generations of exploitation and exclusion, leaving them facing severe poverty, something that isn't especially easy to make it out of. But this story was an amalgamation of foreign governments, local landowners, military leaders, Cold War politics, and corporate interests all playing major roles in the turning point that would soon turn over a government. Because no, the United Fruit Company didn't create Guatemala's entire political system, but it became one of the most powerful symbols and participants in a system where economic power and political power were deeply connected. And in 1954, the system collided with a government that was trying to change those rules. It would lead to a coup where a president would be forced from power, land reform would be reversed, and Guatemala would enter a period of political violence whose consequences would be felt for decades. To understand how United Fruit became so powerful, we have to go back to the Guatemala that it first entered. At the turn of the 20th century, Guatemala was a country with enormous agricultural potential, but the benefits of that land was not distributed equally. Large estates dominated the countryside, and political power was concentrated among wealthy landowners and military governments. But for many indigenous and rural Guatemalans, access to land was limited, labor conditions were harsh, and economic opportunity was scarce. At the same time, foreign investment was growing and was beginning to transform Central America into something completely different. Then, in steps the banana. In the United States and Europe, bananas were turning from an exotic luxury to an everyday food. But getting those bananas from tropical plantations to consumers required all the infrastructure and resources used to cultivate and transport them overseas. But there's one thing that was needed to make the process as easy as possible, and that was control over an entire chain, and ended up being the model that United Fruit perfected. They had the mentality that bananas weren't just fruits. It was the final product of an international system made up of transportation, labor, finance, and political influence. And the company that could manage to master that system would become incredibly powerful. And as the 19th century was coming to an end, the United Fruit Company was beginning to expand its power and influence, making it into a multinational power. Its operations stretched across Central America and the Caribbean. Its famous ships transported bananas to foreign markets. Its plantations produced enormous quantities of fruit, and its transportation networks connected agricultural regions to ports. And in several countries, its economic influence became inseparable from its politics. And Guatemala was not exempted from the reach of United Fruit. According to U.S. government historical documents in the early 1950s, United Fruit dominated Guatemalan banana production, controlled the country's only effective internal transportation system through the International Railway of Central America, and had a virtual monopoly of overseas shipping through its merchant fleet. It was also one of Guatemala's largest employers, controlling or leasing over 40% of its arable land. And just think about what that meant. It controlled all the infrastructure and trade routes that would bring resources in and out of Guatemala. And if one corporation had extraordinary influence over ports, land, and transportation, then it would possess something far more valuable than just money. United Fruit became deeply connected to Guatemala's political system during the long rule of President Jorge Ubico. Ubico ruled Guatemala from 1931 to 1944, and his government offered foreign companies, including United Fruit, highly favorable conditions. The company received major concessions and tax advantages, while Guatemala's economy remained structured around large landholdings and agricultural ports. The relationship was overwhelmingly benefiting the corporation while keeping workers and cultivators of the company living in extreme poverty. That power imbalance would lead to resentment over the banana overlord, and that resentment would soon explode. In 1944, the government of Jorge Ubico collapsed following a popular movement. For Guatemala, this was the beginning of a dramatic political transformation. The next decade would later be known as the Guatemalan Revolution. Juan José Arevalo became president and was seen as a hero to the Guatemalan working class. Workers from rural families praised him for creating social security systems, raising minimum wages, and building schools. Labor rights became stronger, and the political atmosphere began to change. So for the first time in decades, Guatemala was beginning to move away from military dictatorship and embracing true democracy. But the revolution was far from finished. In 1951, a new president took office. His name was Jacobo Árbenz and Árbenz had a much more ambitious vision. He believed that Guatemala needed to break the power of the old system. The country's biggest problem, in his view, was land. Large amounts of land was controlled by wealthy individuals and corporations, while enormous numbers of rural Guatemalans had little or no land of their own. So Árbenz introduced one of the most controversial programs in Guatemalan history, agrarian reform. In 1952, Árbenz's government passed Decree 900, the agrarian reform law. The goal was to redistribute unpurposed private land to the less fortunate and would compensate the owners by the land's proposed value. For hundreds of thousands of rural people, land reform presented something revolutionary. But for Guatemala's wealthy landowners, it was a direct threat. And for the United Fruit Company, it was potentially devastating by the possibility of losing its monopoly over land in Guatemala. And that's exactly what began to happen. In 1953, the Guatemalan government ordered the expropriation of a large portion of United Fruit Company property near Tiquisate under the new agrarian reform law. The government offered compensation based on the land's declared tax value, but United Fruit Company objected, and the issue quickly became international. Because the United Fruit Company wasn't going to fight this battle inside of Guatemala. It was going to go knocking at the door of one of the most communist-fearing countries in the world. The fight over Guatemalan land was about to become part of the Cold War. This was the 1950s, and the Cold War was intensifying. The United States and Soviet Union were competing over global influence. American officials were deeply concerned about communist movements around the world, and Guatemala suddenly appeared on the map as a potential threat. Even though Árbenz was a democratically elected president, there was the fact that Guatemala did have its own communistic political party in the system, and some communists participated in the election of Árbenz. But the question on whether Guatemala was becoming a Soviet satellite or whether the communist threat was exaggerated became one of the most defining controversies of the period. Árbenz was a nationalist reformer. His government wanted to reduce Guatemala's economic dependence on foreign companies. But to the Eisenhower administration, these developments increasingly appeared through the lens of the Cold War. And for opponents of Árbenz, the argument became simple. Guatemala was not merely carrying out land reform, it was becoming a communist country. And once that argument took hold in Washington, the conflict over land became something much larger. It became a geopolitical crisis. United Fruit didn't operate in a political vacuum. It had extensive connections within the American political and business world, and it actively fought against the Guatemalan government's policies. The corporation supported efforts to shape American public opinion and draw attention to the situation in Guatemala, and was even funding many anti-Árbenz plotters to begin movements and plans to overthrow the government. And this is where the story becomes especially important. The Eisenhower administration was genuinely concerned about communist influence in Guatemala. U.S. officials believed that the situation could have consequences far beyond the dispute over bananas. But corporate interests and Cold War ideology began to overlap because one of America's most powerful corporations was threatened by a government who had communist political ties. And those two realities became intertwined in the arguments for intervention. And by 1953, the United States was preparing for action. An overly ambitious name was given to the operation and would go under the title PBSUCCESS. It was a CIA covert operation designed to remove Jacobo Árbenz from power. The United States supported Guatemalan military officer exile Carlos Castillo Armas, who was based outside of the country. The CIA trained Castillo Armas' forces, expanded contracts with Guatemalan military officers, and carried out political and psychological operations intended to undermine Árbenz's government. The strategy all depended on a relatively small military going against the country, but what had to be done was something far more difficult than straight power. Because the strategies depended heavily on psychological warfare, radio broadcasts, propaganda, rumors, diplomatic pressure, and air attacks that were all used as means to sway the Guatemalan people and the military to their cause, convincing them that Árbenz's government was collapsing. The perception of defeat would become more powerful than the actual military defeat. On June 18, 1954, Castillo Armas and his forces entered Guatemala from Honduras. The invading force faced resistance, so the psychological campaign became even more important. CIA-backed operations created an atmosphere of crisis and uncertainty. The propaganda broadcast presented the rebels as stronger than they actually were. The Guatemalan military began questioning whether it could or should continue supporting Árbenz. And eventually the pressure worked, because on June 27th of 1954, Jacobo Árbenz resigned from power. The democratically elected president was gone, and the experiment of the Guatemalan Revolution was effectively over, leaving the country with a new leader. Carlos Castillo Armas, a leader that was not elected by the people, but was put into power by a foreign government, thinking that social reform needed to be put to an end. The overthrow of Jacobo Árbenz did not create all of Guatemala's problems. The country had suffered from inequality, racial discrimination, land concentration, political repression, and authoritarianism long before 1954. But the coup destroyed the democratic reform process and intensified the country's political divisions. Over the following decades, beginning with the 1960s, Guatemala would go into a series of political and unethical turmoil, with many changes in leadership, economic instability, and a long-lasting civil war, leading to a genocide of thousands of native Guatemalans which would not end until 1996. The United Fruit Company caused a coup that would take down a country's government, but we can't say it's the only reason to why Guatemala could never manage to keep stability in its government up until today. After their interference, they took a backseat to Guatemala's government, and eventually the United Fruit Company changed itself. The company would go through corporate transformations and eventually become associated with the name Chiquita Banana International. But the end of the United Fruit name would not erase its historical legacy. The phrase Banana Republic became part of the global political vocabulary. It described countries whose political systems appeared heavily dependent on foreign corporations and agricultural exports. The term itself can oversimplify and stereotype Latin America, but its historical origins point towards something very real: the enormous power that corporations were able to exercise when governments were weak, economies were dependent, and foreign powers were willing to intervene. Guatemala's story became a warning, because what happens when a country's most important infrastructure is controlled by private interests? What happens when access to land is concentrated in the hands of a few? What happens when economic reform threatens foreign investors? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when a powerful nation decides that a political movement inside another country is too dangerous to let continue? Well, in Guatemala, the answer to that was a coup.